Hello. Today's story is a very simple story. It's a simple story with a very simple plot, but gives us a very, very important learning of good manners and how our behavior affects others and how they perceive of the person that we are basis our behavior. This story, to make it very simple, we have kept the names and in identification with the character of the story. So, the main character of the story is Mr. Noisy. So, as his name is, he's a very noisy person. He does everything with a lot of noise and is perceived as a very rude, mean, harsh individual. And you will know why. Then there is some other characters in the story, and we will figure that out as we go. So, Mr. Noisy was very noisy. He would be so loud that you could go deaf with the sound. He would do simple, small things in a day with a lot of noise. Like, for example, he would get up in the morning and he would yawn. That was so loud. But, yeah. He's Mr. Noisy. He would get up in the morning and go yawn. He would get up and brush his teeth. Teeth could fall off with that much sound and harsh noise. But that is Mr. Noisy, so he will do everything noisily, okay? So Mr. Noisy would get up and yawn. He would brush his teeth. He would have a bath. He would wear his clothes also noisily. He would then wear his shoes. He would open the door. It would crash against the wall with that much sound. Then he would walk down the street. This was his ritual. Ritual is something which you do every day. So every day he would go to Mrs. Brown's shop. Mrs. Brown was a baker. He would go and ask her for some bread. So this is how he would go and ask her for some bread. So he would go like, he would open the door of a shop. Crash! He would go and stand in front of Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown! Can I have some bread? That's so loud. Mrs. Brown did not know that this was Mr. Noisy's habit. She used to get terrified, scared of Mrs. Noisy. Oh, yes. Mr. Noisy, tell me what you want. Terrified. And Mr. Noisy would say, could you give me some bread? Yeah, sure. Yeah, take the bread, please. He would keep the money on the counter. He would walk to the door, open the door, crash, close the door, crash. And as a ritual, he would go to the next door grocer for buying some milk. He would go. He would open the door. He would ask, can you give me some milk? Now the grocer was Mr. Brown. The grocer knew Mr. Noisy was very, very noisy, but he was not a bad fellow. So Mr. Brown was like, okay, yeah, you can have this bread. You can have this milk. And then he would open the door, crash, close the door, crash, and walk back home. Have his bread, eat it very noisily, drink all the milk noise, and then go off to sleep and snore. This was his daily routine. One day, Mrs. Brown met Mr. Brown, the grocer. No, they're not related. They're just Brown to make it simple. Okay? He met him. He met Mrs. Brown and he asked her, "Hey, Mrs. Brown, how are you?" "Hi, hello, Mr. Brown. It's so nice to meet you." So Mr. Brown is like, "Okay, I am so terrified of Mr. Noisy. I don't know what to do about it." Mrs. Brown expressed her concern to Mr. Brown. So Mr. Brown tried to explain to her that it was just a bad-mannered Mr. Noisy, but he did not mean any harm. But Mrs. Brown was so terrified. Mr. Brown thought about it for a while and thought, "You know what? I have an idea." And whispered into Mrs. Brown's ears. And they had thought of a plan. Next day, when Mr. Noisy went to Mrs. Brown's shop, he did the same thing in the morning. He woke up, brushed his teeth, had a bath, changed his clothes, walked, opened Mrs. Brown's bakery store, crash, and asked for bread. "Mrs. Brown, can I have some bread?" "Hello, sir. I cannot hear you. Can you please speak a little loudly?" Mr. Noisy was surprised at Mrs. Brown's behavior. Mrs. Brown was behaving strangely. Maybe she couldn't hear him. He needed to be loud. "Mrs. Brown, can you give me some bread, please?" So Mrs. Brown was like, "Sorry, sir. I cannot hear you. You will have to be so loud. I just cannot hear you. Can you be a little loud, please?" Mr. Noisy was frustrated. He screamed louder and louder and louder, and Mrs. Brown just couldn't hear him. He was really tired, and then he just walked away, went to Mr. Brown's grocery store for milk, as his habit was. "Mr. Brown, can I have some milk?" "Hello, sir. So lovely to have you. What do you want?" "Mr. Brown, can I have some milk?" "It's so lovely to have you here, sir, but what do you want? We cannot hear you." He was fed up. He didn't know what to do. He went home, opened his door, closed his door, and went off to sleep hungry. So what happens when you sleep hungry? You don't have energy the next day. So he woke up. No energy. He didn't have any energy. He brushed his teeth slowly. He wore his clothes slowly, wore his shoes slowly, walked slowly, almost tiptoed to Mrs. Brown's shop. opened the door politely, closed the door politely, and slowly, because he had no energy. Mrs. Brown, can you give me some bread, please? Mrs. Brown was surprised to see Mr. Noisy speaking to her in such a polite tone, and that plan had worked. So, yes, sure, please take the bread. He was surprised that Mrs. Brown could hear him. He walked coolly back to Mr. Brown's shop and asked for milk. Mr. Brown, can you give me some milk, please? Mr. Brown, sure. Here, you can have this milk. He took the milk, took the bread, went home, had his milk, had his bread, and went off to sleep. After that day, Mr. Noisy was no longer noisy ever again. He realized the importance of good manners. And now you know what the plan was. It's just you and me.